The sack and the sea, Rome's most terrifying punishment for the worst crime imaginable. Did you know that ancient Rome had a punishment so extreme it was reserved for only one specific crime? And it involved sewing the condemned person alive into a leather sack together with a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, then throwing the entire sack into the sea. Rome, 100 BC. The punishment was called Poena Cullei, the penalty of the sack. It was not torture for its own sake. It was a precisely designed ritual with specific animals chosen for specific symbolic reasons, documented by Cicero himself. And the crime that earned it was considered so monstrous that ordinary execution was not enough. What was that crime? Killing your own parents. Roman civilization was built on a foundation that its people called pietas, a concept that modern English translates inadequately as piety, but that meant something far more specific and far more demanding in Roman culture. Pietas was the obligation of proper conduct toward the gods, toward the state, and toward one's family. It was the moral glue that held Roman society together, the principle that required a son to honor his father, a citizen to serve his city, a mortal to respect the divine order. Within this framework, the worst thing a Roman citizen could do, worse than murder, worse than treason, worse than any other crime the Roman legal imagination could conceive, was to kill a parent. The Latin word for this act was parricidium, from which the English word parricide descends. The original meaning covered not just the killing of a father, but the killing of any close relative, mother, sibling, grandparent, though the most severe application was always reserved for the killing of a father or mother. The reason parricidium occupied this unique position in Roman legal and moral thinking was what it represented symbolically. The family unit in Roman society was not simply a domestic arrangement. It was the basic building block of the entire social order. The authority of the pater familias, the male head of household, was the foundation on which Roman law, Roman religion, and Roman political philosophy all rested. A son who killed his father was not simply committing a murder. He was committing an act of cosmic disorder. He was destroying the very principle of authority and obligation that made civilization possible. This explains why ordinary execution was considered insufficient for parricidium. A man convicted of ordinary murder could be crucified or thrown to wild animals or executed by sword. These punishments ended a life. The punishment for killing your parents had to do something more. It had to express in physical and symbolic form the total and irreversible exclusion of the offender from human society, from the natural world, and from any possibility of the peaceful afterlife that Roman religion promised to those who died properly. The Poena Cullei, the penalty of the sack, is documented in Roman legal and literary sources extending from the early Republic through the later imperial period. According to the ancient sources, including the legal historian Modestinus and the orator Cicero, the punishment had roots in Roman law that predated the formal legal codification that came with Sulla's reforms in the early 1st century BC. The earliest documented form of the punishment appears in connection with the 12 Tables, the foundational written legal code of the Roman Republic, inscribed around 450 BC. The specific provision dealing with parricidium in the 12 Tables has not survived in full, but references in later legal writing confirm that the punishment for killing a parent was considered separate and more severe than the punishment for ordinary homicide
from the earliest period of Roman written law. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, the Roman dictator who reformed the legal system in the 80s BC, codified and standardized the Poena Cullei through legislation known as the Lex Cornelia de Sicariis et Veneficis, the Cornelian law on assassins and poisoners. This law brought together various provisions related to violent crimes and specified the sack punishment for parricidium, with the detail that subsequent sources describe and build upon. Cicero, the great Roman orator and lawyer who lived and practiced during the 1st century BC, addressed parricidium cases in his legal speeches and discussed the Poena Cullei with the precision of someone who had both theoretical and practical knowledge of how the punishment worked. His account is one of the most detailed surviving descriptions of the punishment's philosophical and symbolic rationale. According to Cicero, the punishment was designed not merely to kill, but to express complete severance. The condemned person was to be separated from sky, water, earth, and all of nature itself, because someone who had destroyed the most fundamental human bond had placed themselves outside the natural order entirely. The 4 animals included in the sack with the condemned person were not chosen randomly. Each had a specific symbolic meaning within Roman religious and cultural thinking, and together they formed a deliberate statement about the moral character of the person being punished. Understanding why these 4 animals were chosen requires understanding how Romans thought about the qualities they represented. The snake was the most straightforwardly symbolic choice. In Roman religious and moral thinking, the snake was associated with treachery, with the sudden strike that comes without warning, with the poison that kills invisibly. A person who had killed their own parent had committed an act of precisely this kind of treachery, an attack on someone who trusted them completely, from within the household that should have been the safest place in the world. The snake's presence announced that the condemned person was, in essence, a snake, a creature of hidden poison and fatal betrayal. The dog was included for reasons that require some explanation for modern audiences, who tend to think of dogs positively. In Roman cultural thinking, the dog was an ambiguous animal, valued as a guard and hunter, but also associated, in its most negative aspects, with shamelessness, with the willingness to eat anything without discrimination, with a lack of the dignity that Romans considered essential to proper human conduct. The dog represented the degraded, shameless quality of a person who had killed their own family. The rooster, sometimes described in ancient sources as a fighting cock, represented aggressive, indiscriminate violence. The rooster fights anything, without mercy and without reason, driven purely by combative instinct. This quality mirrored what Romans saw in the parricide, someone who had turned violence against a target that should have been protected above all others. The monkey was the most psychologically complex choice. Romans found monkeys deeply unsettling precisely because they resembled humans without being human. The monkey was a mockery of human form. It looked like a person, but lacked the reason, virtue, and social capacity that made a person genuinely human. Including a monkey in the sack communicated that the condemned person had forfeited their claim to humanity. They resembled a human being, but were no longer one. The execution of Poena Cullei was not simply a matter of locating a leather sack and some animals. It was a ceremony, a carefully prescribed sequence of ritual acts that preceded and framed the final act of drowning. This ceremonial dimension was essential to the punishment's purpose, because the purpose was not simply to kill. It was to communicate, publicly and unmistakably, the complete exclusion of the condemned person from the community of the living and the properly dead. The condemned person was beaten with rods before the execution. These were not ordinary rods. They were described in some sources as virgae sanguinii, rods coloured red or associated with blood. The beating was public, conducted before the procession to the water, visible to anyone who wished to witness it. This was the physical expression of the community's condemnation, the visible mark that separated this execution from any other. The condemned person was made to wear wooden shoes, sandals made of wood rather than the leather footwear of ordinary Romans. The symbolism was specific. Wooden shoes prevented direct contact between the condemned person's feet and the earth. The earth, in Roman religious thinking, was not merely soil. It was a sacred substance, connected to the gods of the underworld, to the ancestors buried in it, to the cycle of life and death that the Romans understood as sacred. A person guilty of parricidium was not permitted to touch it, because their touch would defile it. The condemned person's head was covered with a sack made of wolfskin before their procession began. This covering served multiple purposes. It prevented the condemned from seeing clearly, a disorientation that increased the helplessness of their situation. It also effected a symbolic transformation. The wolfskin stripped the condemned of their human appearance, replacing it with the skin of a wild animal, marking the transition from person to something other than person that the punishment was designed to accomplish. The procession moved through the city to the water. According to the ancient sources, it was conducted on a cart drawn by black oxen, with the condemned visible to the public throughout. The public nature of the procession was deliberate. The community needed to witness the expulsion of the person who had violated its most fundamental principle. The leather sack used for Poena Cullei was made from thick cowhide, durable enough to survive the initial submersion without immediate failure, substantial enough to create the enclosed space that the punishment required. The construction was functional and deliberate, not so thick that it would never let water in, which would have defeated one of the punishment's purposes, but substantial enough to delay the inevitable for long enough that the full experience of the punishment could be undergone. Getting the animals into the sack alongside the condemned person was, according to the logic of the ancient accounts, one of the more practically challenging aspects of the execution. The dog, the rooster, the snake, and the monkey each had to be introduced into the same confined space as a frightened and presumably struggling human being, and the mouth of the sack had to be sealed tightly enough that none of them could escape once the binding was complete. Once sealed, the environment inside the sack would have been specific and terrible in ways that modern environmental science can describe precisely. The oxygen available to the occupants was limited to what was enclosed when the sack was sealed, minus whatever escaped through imperfections in the lever. 5 living creatures, a human being and 4 animals, would consume that oxygen at a rate that depended on their metabolic activity. Fear and stress massively increase metabolic rate. The animals, confined with an unfamiliar human in a dark and lurching space, would have been in states of extreme stress. The human, aware of exactly what was happening, would have been in a state of terror. The heat would have built quickly. 5 warm-blooded organisms in an enclosed space generate significant heat, and leather insulates. The darkness was complete. The noise, breathing, animal movements, the sounds of stressed creatures would have been immediate and inescapable. The animals, driven by fear and the instinct to respond to threat, would have bitten and scratched at whatever was near them. The condemned person, unable to escape or control what was happening, would have experienced all of this in full conscious awareness until the oxygen ran out. The physiological sequence that occurred inside a sealed Poena Cullei sac can be described with reasonable precision using modern knowledge of asphyxiation, animal behavior under stress, and the mechanics of enclosed space oxygen depletion. The ancient Romans did not know this science, but they knew the outcomes from observation, and they designed the punishment to produce specific experiences. Oxygen depletion in a sealed space occupied by 5 living organisms would have produced measurable effects within minutes. Normal atmospheric air is approximately 21% oxygen. As the occupants consumed oxygen and exhaled carbon dioxide, the oxygen percentage would have dropped progressively. At around 17%, the first symptoms of oxygen deficiency appear: mild disorientation, slightly impaired judgment. At 14%, more significant cognitive impairment begins. Below 10%, loss of consciousness becomes likely. Below 6%, death follows rapidly. The carbon dioxide buildup would have accompanied the oxygen depletion, and high carbon dioxide concentrations produce their own distinctive distress, a sensation of suffocation, a compulsion to breathe that becomes more desperate as the breathing itself provides less relief. This experience is described consistently in modern accounts of asphyxiation as among the most distressing forms of dying, precisely because the impulse to breathe is biological
rather than voluntary and cannot be suppressed regardless of intellectual understanding of the situation. The animals in the sack would have behaved in ways consistent with what behavioral science knows about confined and frightened animals. Dogs in extreme stress situations bite. This is documented behavior that requires no special conditions to predict. Snakes, disturbed and compressed, will bite defensively. Roosters, cornered, use their beaks and leg spurs. The monkey, perhaps the most cognitively complex of the 4, would have been capable of a level of distress response that the other animals were not. What the Romans chose, whether they fully understood the specific mechanisms or not, was a combination of animals that would actively worsen the experience of the person enclosed with them. The final act of the Poena Cullei, the throwing of the sealed sack into the sea, or in some documented cases into a river, was not simply the method of killing. It was the concluding element of a ritual whose full meaning only becomes clear when understood in terms of Roman religious belief about death, burial, and the afterlife. In Roman religious practice, proper burial was not a courtesy, it was a necessity. The soul of a person who died without proper burial, whose body was not interred in the earth with appropriate ritual, whose family did not perform the prescribed observances, was understood to be unable to reach the underworld. Such a soul wandered, unable to cross into the realm of the properly dead, potentially dangerous to the living as a restless and unsatisfied spirit. The Romans had a specific term for these souls, manes. They were feared and propitiated in specific ritual contexts. The Poena Cullei denied every element of proper burial. The condemned person's body was not interred in earth. It was thrown into moving water. Moving water was specifically chosen because it ensured that the body would be carried away, that it would not come to rest in any identifiable place, that it would not accumulate in the ground that proper burial required. The sack containing the body and the animals would eventually disintegrate in the water, dispersing the remains in a way that precluded any gathering of bones for burial. No family member was permitted to mourn. No funeral rites were conducted.
The property of the condemned was confiscated by the state, removing the material evidence of the person's former existence from the family's possession. In Roman religious understanding, this combination of circumstances condemned the soul of the parricide to perpetual wandering, the ultimate punishment that extended beyond death into eternity. The punishment was designed to kill the body, destroy the social identity, seize the material legacy, and condemn the soul. It was as total an erasure as the Roman legal and religious imagination could conceive. The execution of Poena Cullei was rare. The historical sources make clear that parricidium itself was considered so monstrous that its actual occurrence was unusual, which is partly why the punishment attached to it was so extreme. But the historical record has preserved several specific cases that allow us to understand how the punishment operated in actual legal practice, rather than just in the abstract descriptions of legal texts. The most detailed case documented in ancient sources involves a man named Malleolus, who is identified in Roman legal history as the first person to be executed under the Poena Cullei. According to the ancient accounts, Malleolus killed his mother and was tried and convicted around 100 BC, the period when Sulla's legal reforms were codifying the punishment's specifics. His case is referenced by later Roman legal writers as the foundational precedent for the punishment's application, suggesting that it was either the first formal execution under the specific provisions of the Lex Cornelia, or the first sufficiently prominent case to be recorded as a legal reference point. Cicero's legal speeches contain references to parricidium cases that he either defended or prosecuted, and his discussions of the Poena Cullei in these speeches are among the most philosophically detailed treatments of the punishment's rationale in the surviving literature. Cicero was genuinely fascinated by the question of what a punishment for such an extreme crime should look like, and his analysis of the sack punishment's symbolic logic, exclusion from earth, sky, and water, the denial of burial, the association with animals that embodied the qualities of the crime, shows a mind working through the legal philosophy of extreme punishment with considerable sophistication. Later imperial period legal documents preserve additional cases, though the details are often sparse. The legal writings of Modestinus, a 3rd century AD jurist, discuss the Poena Cullei in the context of reviewing earlier legal precedents, and his summary of the punishment's requirements and application confirms that it remained a formal part of Roman law for centuries after its initial codification. The specific form of the Poena Cullei was not static across the centuries of Roman history during which it remained a legal provision. The historical sources document a gradual evolution in how the punishment was applied, changes that reflect both the shifting cultural values of different imperial periods and the practical difficulties of maintaining a punishment that required the procurement and coordination of specific animals. The Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 AD, and who was known for his interest in legal reform and philosophical governance, modified the application of the Poena Cullei according to legal sources from his period. Under Hadrian's influence, the requirement for all 4 animals appears to have been relaxed in some circumstances, with the snake remaining as the most symbolically essential component, reflecting the serpent's consistent association with treachery and the specific quality of parricidal betrayal. Whether this represented a formal legal change or simply a shift in how judges exercised discretion is debated by modern scholars of Roman law. The Emperor Constantine, who converted to Christianity and ruled the empire in the early 4th century AD, revived and, in some accounts, intensified the use of Poena Cullei. a decision that scholars have found somewhat paradoxical given Christianity's general movement toward less brutal forms of justice. Constantine's revival of the punishment is documented in his legal edicts and is generally understood as reflecting his concern with the moral order of the family and his willingness to use extreme legal measures to enforce social norms he considered foundational. The codification of Roman law under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD, the Corpus Juris Civilis, which became the foundation of European civil law, preserved the Poena Cullei as a legal provision while increasingly framing it in terms that acknowledged its exceptional and symbolic character. By Justinian's period, the punishment appears in the legal record more as a statement of principle, the absolute severity of parricidium as a category of crime, than as a frequently applied practical sentence. The Poena Cullei outlasted the Roman Empire in a form that no Roman jurist would have recognized, but that preserved the essential logic of the original punishment. In medieval Germany, a version of sack drowning was applied to cases of parricide and certain other extreme crimes, documented in legal records and described by medieval legal commentators who explicitly traced the practice back to Roman law. The specific animals changed in some versions, and the sack material varied, but the core symbolic structure remained: enclosure, animals, water, denial of burial, exclusion from the community of the properly dead. The trajectory from Roman law through Byzantine codification to medieval European legal practice represents one of the clearest examples of legal inheritance in Western history. The Romans invented a punishment that was not simply brutal, but was carefully philosophically designed. A punishment that expressed through physical action a complete theory of what parricidium meant and why it demanded treatment unlike any other crime. That theory, once formulated, proved extraordinarily durable. The question that the Poena Cullei poses to modern reflection is not simply whether it was just or unjust by contemporary standards. It is what the punishment reveals about the civilization that created it. A legal system that developed the Poena Cullei was a legal system that took the symbolic and religious dimensions of justice seriously enough to encode them in law. The 4 animals were not there because Roman lawyers were sadistic. They were there because Roman lawyers were trying to express, in physical form,
complete moral and cosmological judgment about what the crime represented. Modern legal systems have largely abandoned the idea that punishment should express symbolic and religious truth. We focus on deterrence, on rehabilitation, on proportionality, on the protection of society. These are legitimate concerns, but the Roman approach to the most extreme crimes, the insistence that some acts require a response that goes beyond the merely practical, that some violations of the social order demand acknowledgement at the level of symbol and ritual as well as law, reflects a seriousness about the meaning of crime and justice that deserves at least to be understood on its own terms. The sack, the animals, the sea, the wandering soul. It was designed to last forever, and in the legal and cultural memory of Europe, in some form, it did.